All right, let's see if we're going. Make sure we're live on the YouTubes. I think we're there. I have like 5 windows open, so let's see if this works. Hello, and welcome to another live stream. This week we're talking about food. We just had a podcast come out at podcast.tcmstudy.net where we talked to Warren Sheir about food, diet, food therapy, and what it's like to write a book. And so I thought here what we can do is I can give some of my opinions on just food, diet, food therapy from a TCM perspective. And so it's good. Some people are here. Sorry, I think I messed things up with the hello. I think I messed some things up with scheduling this that usually I do. I want to schedule the live stream for 10 a.m. Pacific, and I put in the YouTube's 10 a.m., and that was actually 10 a.m. Mountain Time. So I'm sorry if people got messed up with the timing, that I put the timing wrong. So if you were here an hour early and I wasn't here, sorry about that. But like I said, I want to talk about food this time. We just had a podcast with Warren, author of the book Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen. I wish I had a picture to put up, but the book Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen, it's a really good book. It's a book I recommend to both students or both to practitioners and to patients, that if you're a practitioner, it's a good book for you to read. It's also a good book to recommend to your patients if they want to get into healthier eating and food and dietary stuff like that. I have a weird microphone here because I was thinking I could record this and this could be like a bonus episode for the podcast. So that's why I have my fancier mic on, and I'm trying to record this both in YouTube and in Audition. So I think it's going in both places. Maybe we can put my levels up a little bit. So if I'm a little scatterbrained, it's because I was trying to set up a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm not entirely sure if it's working, so we'll get going eventually here. Jenny is here. Hi, Jenny. Yuan Yo from the UK. Hello, hello. Jai always here. Ooh, from the Netherlands. Hello, thanks for being here. Sorry, I'm going to drink my tea. I'm a little like over caffeinated and I was trying to do too many things at the last minute, so let's see if we can get this going. Oh, good evening. Casper from the Netherlands. Hello. A lot of people coming in from all over, so that's awesome. I feel like my microphone's clipping a little bit, so this is a question. I'm getting distracted by this question, so I'm gonna. Why are there 8 extraordinary confluent points? I guess what do you mean by the 8 extra? Are you talking about the 8 extraordinary channels, and that there are like the master points or the confluent points for the 8 extraordinary channels? Or are you talking about the 8 influential points? Serena's here from Denver. Hello. I'm in Broomfield, so that's awesome. So we got a lot of people from all over the place. Here, let me check Sorry, I'm just checking some things on the YouTube, so we should actually like get started. Yes, when you say yes, do you mean the 8 extraordinary channels? And actually, that's a weird thing. I actually don't know if we're talking about the 8 extraordinary channels. The 8 extraordinary channels are weird. And I actually don't know where the points came from. Oh, yeah. So that's what I was thinking the question would be is when we talk about, we sometimes call them master couple points. Sometimes we call them confluent points. Sometimes we call them the opening points. Why are those points the way they are? Honestly, I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody knows. I'm not sure where those popped up. I think there's no mention of them in the Nanjing. I'm not sure where they popped up. So that's there's a scholar group on Facebook. I might go research it there to see where that popped up with the 8 extraordinary vessels. But there is kind of a funny story about the master and couple points that in the Machiocha textbook, he mentions this thing about the order in which you should needle the points. So he would say, women are always right, men are left behind. So when you have a female patient, you do the master point on the right side and the couple point on the left side. Whereas with men, it's the other way around. If you have a man, you do the master point on the left side and the couple point on the right side. And he just kind of said that in his book, and nobody knew why. And so I think there was one time when Machiocha was at our school, somebody finally asked him, like, we keep reading about this thing, this right and left thing. Where did that come from, and why is that? And his answer was, I'm telling the story secondhand. I don't know if this is true, but the story I heard was he was just kind of like, I'm not actually really sure. This is just something that I learned it from one of my teachers, but I don't remember which teacher it was. And I don't remember why they said that, but that's just something one of my teachers did, so I just always do it the same way. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, where those master like why is lung 7 the master point of the Ren? I don't know. I would have to do more research about that. Sorry, it's taking me a little bit of a while to get started. Kind of a busy morning. But basically, we wanted to talk about food and dietary therapy. And like I said, we had a podcast with Warren. And so that was kind of a conversation with Warren. When we're on the podcast, I like to bring guests in, and I kind of just want to let them talk about what they're interested, or just have a conversation with them and try to make it more about what they have to say and not just interject my opinion too much. It's like I don't want to invite a guest on and then try to have me be talking the whole time. That just seems kind of weird. But this is a live stream, so this is where I get to talk by myself for whatever I want, for as much as I want. So that's what we're going to do here. Is now instead of having a conversation, I'm just going to tell you what I think about food therapy and dietary interventions, and kind of give some things that I thought about as I was editing the podcast, some of the things I wanted to mention and didn't, and then just some of my own opinions on some of the things we discussed. So that's what we're going to do today, and I have my slightly fancier microphone because I might try to record the audio and have this be like a bonus episode of the podcast, and we can release that as like a part 2 of what was going on with Warren. So let's try that. It looks like my Adobe Audition is recording, so I think we're going to be good. Get my things out of the way, make sure my buttons work. And let's get going. I think the screen is going to distract me, but let's get going. So last week on the podcast, we had Warren Sheir on, author of the cookbook Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen. And this is a really good book. This is a book I recommend to everybody, and everybody likes it. I think it's a good book for practitioners, but it's also a good book for practitioners to give to their patients. If you have patients who are interested in eating healthier or changing their diet or just trying new things and learning more about Chinese medicine, it's a really good book to give to your patients as well. Basically, the way it's split up is like the first 100 pages or so, give a little background on TCM theory and on food therapy or food theory. It gives so basically the way it's set up is like the first 100 pages is gives you a little bit of a primer on TCM theory, and also some of the theory behind a lot of food ingredients, the sort of the taste, temperature, entering channel, and properties of a lot of different food ingredients. It's kind of like a materia medica for food. Things like adzuki beans are good for draining dampness, or honey tonifies the spleen, but it's also a moist laxative. So the first half is some very accessible TCM theory. The second part is just very easy to follow recipes. They're really good recipes. It's made for more of a Western audience, so nothing too out there for a Western audience. and it's really easy to follow recipes and has a lot of good tips and good stories. So it's really easy to follow. It's a good book both for practitioners and for patients. So when we had Warren on, we had a conversation about food therapy, what it's like to write a book. And normally with the podcast, when I have a guest on, I want to see what the guest thinks and get their opinion most of the time. I don't want to invite somebody on and then have me talking most of the time. And so I really wanted to let Warren do most of the talking. But now I'm here by myself. So what I'm going to do is give you some of my opinions on some of the things we discussed. Some of them are things that I thought of afterwards as I was editing the podcast. So I thought I'd just go through and give you some of my thoughts on some of the things we touched on. Oh, I had way too much coffee this morning. So one of the first questions I asked Warren is, do we as practitioners, are we putting enough emphasis on food therapy and on dietary interventions when it comes to patient outcomes? Because there's a saying in the book because there's this quote in the book that goes something like, if a patient is sick, first change their diet. If that doesn't work, then give them tea. And if that still doesn't work, then give them acupuncture and herbs. And if that's the real order of things, are we putting enough emphasis on changing the diet and the food therapy? Or another way, sorry, I have bugs coming up again. Or another way of putting this is I had a friend who would always say that, in America, people come in for acupuncture like once a week. And that's not very much. If you're lucky enough that you can get them to take herbs, they usually take herbs once or twice a day, but it's still a really small amount. It's like 100 grams of distilled roots and sticks. And so that's still not really very much. But when you compare it to food, people are eating 3, 4, 5 times a day, and they're eating a large amount. And so what's happening with their food is just way more influential than what's happening when they take herbs or what's happening when they come in once a week for acupuncture. And so it's kind of like in fitness, there's this saying that you can't outrun a bad diet, that if you have a bad diet, it doesn't matter how much exercise you do, that can't make up for a crappy diet. And I think it's the same thing with taking herbs. It's like a shitty diet with supplements is still a shitty diet. If you're eating a bad food, no amount of herbs is going to make up for that bad food. So it's kind of like, are we as practitioners putting enough emphasis on that food aspect, or are we just kind of ignoring that and say, let's throw in some needles and maybe give them some herbs and hope for the best? And so Warren kind of gave a really good response to this. He kind of said two things. He said, number one, yes, we aren't putting enough emphasis on food therapy, but it's also like, that's really not what patients are coming in for most of the time. And I think this is true. It's kind of like we have to strike this weird balance of we want to instruct our patients and give them good advice about what they should be doing because we need our patients to meet us halfway. They need to be putting in some effort on their side as well. So we need to address that. But we have to do it in such a way that we don't alienate them. Because if a patient comes in and you're like, oh, you need to stop eating sugar, you need to quit smoking, you need to quit drinking, you need to sleep more, you need to be less stressed, a lot of times that might just alienate the patient and they won't come back. And that's bad because if your patient doesn't come in, and that's bad because if your patient isn't coming back, then you don't make money. But it means that you're not helping them. That maybe if they just came in for needles, you would help them 50%. But now because they're not coming in at all, you're helping them 0%. So we kind of have to have this delicate balance of we want to give these kind of lifestyle advices, but we have to do it in a way that the patient is receptive to it. And sometimes that involves very gently nudging them along. That if you try to be too forceful to it, they'll either dig in their heels and resist or they just won't come back. So that was kind of his first part where it's like, yes, we should be putting more emphasis on this, but that's really not what patients are coming in for. And I kind of agree. Then the other thing he said that I thought was interesting is that if that were really the order of operations, if we really focused on food first, tea second, and acupuncture and herbs third, if that's really what we did, then 80% of our patients would not be coming in to see us. And I completely agree with that. And I think that's, to some extent, that's why I've become a little bit jaded seeing patients that sometimes, if I'm being honest, it's like I feel like 80% of my patients don't actually need acupuncture. I feel like they're just very simple lifestyle modifications that they would make that would make acupuncture and herbs unnecessary. It's kind of like if people would just exercise, and when I say exercise, I mean both some cardiovascular aerobic exercise plus some strength training. If they would stretch, not that you need to go join a yoga class, but maybe just do a little bit of stretching every day. And if they would make some simple dietary modifications, then that would actually fix 80% of the problems that I see in my patients. And they wouldn't need acupuncture, they wouldn't need herbs. And so, at least for me, sometimes that just gets really frustrating. And I think maybe that just means I'm not a very empathetic person. So, I don't know. Yeah, and Victor is saying that goes for all healthcare, though. Yeah, and that's true. I think even probably medical doctors feel the same way. That if you would just fix your diet and do some exercise, if you quit smoking, then you wouldn't need these medications, you wouldn't need these surgeries, you wouldn't need these interventions. And I think in America we've kind of gotten to that point where people want that quick fix. They don't want to make these long-term changes. And so again, maybe that's just like I'm a jerk and I'm not a very empathetic practitioner, but that sometimes that just gets really frustrating that I'm kind of like, you don't actually need acupuncture. You don't actually need herbs. You could do this yourself. So that was the first thing we said is, wrong one, is do we put enough emphasis on food therapy? Sorry, I'm just going to check my notes. I was going to try to make this a part 2 of the podcast. I'm not sure if I'm digging that right now, so we might just make this a live stream and not try to edit it into a podcast. We'll see how it goes. We'll see if I can salvage something out of this. So that was our first one, is we talked about, do practitioners put enough emphasis on food therapy? The second thing I asked him is, this is a question I get from a lot of patients, or I've had people come into the clinic ask this, where they want to ask, what's the ideal diet according to TCM? Or is there such a thing as a Chinese medicine diet? What should I be doing with my diet according to TCM? And I think that when people ask this question, basically they're asking for a set of rules. It's kind of like if you follow a paleo diet, there's a set of rules of you should eat these things and not eat these things. If you follow a keto diet, there's a set of rules about what you should and shouldn't eat. If you follow the Whole30 diet, there's a set of rigid rules. It's very black and white. Eat these things, don't eat these things. And so I think when people are asking this question, they're asking, are there these rules according to TCM about eat these foods, don't eat those foods? And as far as I know, it's really not that black and white. I think sometimes we have some simple rules according to Yang Sheng, nourishing life, things like you should eat with the seasons, you should have a balance of the 5 colors and the 5 flavors in your food. I think I read one person would say that if you eat meat, make sure you eat meat with a sauce. So don't just eat plain meat. It should have some other herbs and other ingredients in there to help with digestion. That's why Chinese cuisine has a lot of soy sauce, vinegar, rice wine, ginger, garlic, scallions. Those are to warm the middle jaw and help you digest. So whenever you eat meat, you should include some sort of sauce that will help with digestion. But other than that, I don't think there are any main rules or black and white, eat this, don't eat that, like you would see with these other types of diets like paleo, keto, carnivore, Whole30, Mediterranean diet, anything like that. So kind of thing we emphasize with the ideal diet is just the fact that every body is different. And so everybody has different dietary needs. And I think I mean this And when I say everybody is different, I mean this both on a genetic level, or we could say constitution, but also just in terms of preferences and lifestyle. So in terms of genetics, every body is different. There are some people that just genetically, they're able to metabolize fats a lot better. Other people are just able to metabolize carbohydrates. So some people do really well on a high-fat, low-carb diet. Some people do really well on a high-carb, low-fat diet. And that's something you might just have to experiment with and see what works best for you. It's not like one way is the correct way. For an extreme example of this, there's a YouTube channel, What I've Learned, and they did one video where they took 2 case studies. They had 2 people with very serious health problems, the autoimmune disorders, a lot of inflammation, the really debilitating health problems. Well, there was one person that he went on a vegan diet, and going on a vegan diet just magically fixed all of his problems. His autoimmune disorders went away, his inflammation went down, he lost weight, and his health just got exponentially better. There was another girl that was having a lot of health problems, and she did the exact opposite. She went on a carnivore diet. She was basically eating only meat, mostly red meat, and it actually worked really well. All this immune disorder she'd been suffering from a long time went away, and her health got exponentially better just by doing a meat-only diet. I think eventually she added in spinach. But I think this kind of highlights that you can have very opposite approaches that will work for different people. And so that's something we need to take into account. And I think we can also take into account just lifestyle preferences or personal preferences, that not everything works for everybody. Like, for example, I had one friend who went on the Whole30 diet, and physically it worked really well for her. She lost weight, she had a lot of energy, she felt really good. But after a while, she realized it was not good for her mental health, that she realized she was just becoming so obsessive about food and so neurotic that was actually causing her emotional stress trying to follow this diet. So even though it was doing good things for her physically, in terms of her lifestyle and her personal preferences, it was actually causing some emotional harm trying to follow this diet. Whereas some people follow it and they do great all around. So it really depends on the person. And something interesting that Warren brought up is this also depends on your family situation as well. That, like for me, I'm a sad single person. I live alone. I'm self-employed, and I never go outside. So what works really well for me is I'm one of those weirdos that I like to weigh all my food. I have a spreadsheet where I track all my macros, and that works really well for me, and that's something I enjoy doing. Most people probably don't enjoy doing that, and if you're in a family situation, you probably can't do that. That's just not feasible when you're cooking in a group or taking into account other people in your household. You might not be able to do those same things. So we have to take into account those lifestyle situations as well. And sorry, I was looking at my notes. And so I think what am I trying to say? And so I think one of the ways that we as practitioners need to be careful about this is you have to understand that just because something works really well for you, that doesn't mean it works really well for everybody. So just because you went on a gluten-free diet and it worked really well for you, that doesn't mean that 100% of your patients need to be gluten-free. Just because you tried the paleo diet and you saw a lot of benefits, that doesn't mean that you should be recommending the paleo diet to everybody who comes through your door. And so I think some people lose sight of this, that different things work for different people. Maybe we could use the analogy of exercise. Again, I'm one of those weirdos that I like to go to the gym. I'll go to the gym for 2 hours a day, lift weights alone by myself and not talk to everybody. And it's great. I love it. But I know that that's not the form of exercise that everybody prefers. Some people, they need to be outside. So what works for them is going running, going hiking, doing outdoor activities. Some people need a social aspect to it. So they go to group classes, things like CrossFit classes, jazzercise classes, pole dancing classes, something where you're in a group environment and you get to be around other people. It's those different things work for different people. And so if you were to ask, like, what's the best exercise plan, it's really the best exercise is the one that you do. So it's just kind of like find something that you like and do that. And I think we can apply the same thing to diet and food therapy, that different things work for different people. And so the best diet is the one that works for you. And that might involve some experimentation. The only kind of caveat here is when you start experimenting, you have to be honest with yourself about what kind of results you're getting. So like, for example, I had some roommates in college that they went on a raw vegan diet, and honestly, it was not working well for them, but it was like such a restrictive diet and they were putting so much effort into it. I think they were trying to convince themselves that it was really good. So they're like, oh, how's that raw vegan thing doing? It's like, oh, I feel great. I have so much energy. I'm like, really? Because you look kind of terrible. And they're like, yeah, I'm cold all the time. And I stopped having my period, but that's a good thing, right? I'm like, no, that's not good. And so you have to be honest about, is this actually working for you when you try to make those changes? Sorry, glancing over here. So that's kind of what we were talking. So I guess those are some of my thoughts on what the ideal diet should be. We just have to recognize that every body is different, so every body has different needs. And so it's not really that we necessarily need to be recommending this is the one diet that everybody should follow. I think it's better for people to try different things, experiment on themselves, and see what works for them. Then another thing we talked about in the podcast with Warren is what are the main principles that people should focus on in their diets? Because I don't know about you, but this is something I've kind of observed, that a lot of people, when it comes to food, a lot of people like to focus on the small details. We might call this, they see the trees, but they forget the forest, or they're majoring in the minors, that they're paying attention to these little minutiae that really aren't moving the needle very much, really don't have major results in terms of health. People are like, oh, I need to eat blueberries because they have antioxidants. People will obsess over the difference between organic and non-organic produce. Is frozen food okay? Is microwave killing the chi of my food? I'm going to eat, what kind of oil should I be using? Oh, I'm going to eat coconut oil because it has those medium chain triglycerides, and those are metabolized differently in the liver. And I think to me, those are just like small details. They're not making major contributions in terms of changes to your health. So if those are the small details, we can ask, what are the big picture things that we should be focusing on when it comes to health? And I think Warren gave a good answer. He went back to this other saying of eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that's kind of a basic saying of eat food as in eat real food as opposed to processed food or things that we know aren't actually food. Not too much as in control the amount that you're eating. And mostly plants. And this is something that Warren talked about, that traditionally in Chinese food therapy, they emphasize a small amount of meat, so not necessarily like a carnivore diet. So eat mostly plants. And I think I would mostly agree with that. I guess maybe some modifications I would make are, or I guess I'll say, these are the things that I think people should focus on when it comes to changing their diet. Number one, I think the most important thing when it comes to your diet and health is actually the amount of food that you eat. And when I say amount, I mean specifically the number of calories. That this is going to have one of the largest this is going to be one of the largest determinants of your health, is just the sheer amount of food that you eat. And this is something that goes both ways. I've seen some people that they just don't eat enough. Like I knew someone in school that she was just complaining that she's tired all the time. She has no energy. She was trying to be a massage therapist, but she would do 1 or 2 massages and she'd just be wiped out. It felt like her arms were falling off and she just didn't have any energy. And so she was trying to get acupuncture, trying to figure out an herbal formula that would work for her. Well, then eventually for one of her class projects, she had to keep a food diary. And it turns out that when she estimated what should be her caloric expenditure, it was like she should be getting 1,800 calories, but she was only eating like 1,300 calories. So it's like, of course you're tired all the time. You're just not eating enough calories. And I think that sticking needles in you or giving you some herbal supplements is not really going to make much of a change in that until you start eating a sufficient amount so that you have energy. But then oftentimes it goes the other way as well, where people are just eating too much and they're overwhelming their spleen. There's just too much food on top of it. There's too much going into their system that their spleen can't process. Usually there's too much of the sweet flavor overwhelming the spleen. And then we get dampness and other signs that look like spleen qi deficiency. And so maybe just as an example of this might be a weird or controversial opinion, but a lot of people point to this old kind of documentary, Super Size Me, where this guy did this experiment where he ate only McDonald's food for like 1 month and documented what changes in his health occurred through eating only McDonald's. And people like to look at this and say, oh, this is just proof that fast food is bad, the American diet is bad, McDonald's is evil. When really, if you pay attention to what's going on in that movie, one of the rules he made for himself is if ever the cashier asked, would you like that supersized? He made it a rule that he had to say yes, and then he would force himself to finish the food even if he wasn't hungry. So, like, I'm not saying that McDonald's is good food or there's nothing wrong with McDonald's food, but you have to realize that one of the reasons he had such poor health outcomes is he was eating like 6,000 calories a day. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're eating McDonald's or if you're eating organic, free-range, high-quality meat from Whole Foods. If you're eating 6,000 calories, that's going to overwhelm your system and it's going to cause a lot of problems, regardless of how high quality the food is. And so other people have done experiments on themselves where they ate nothing but McDonald's, but they ate a normal amount or they ate at a caloric deficit, and they were actually able to have good health outcomes. That turns out when you eat the correct amount of food, then that can have an effect on things like your cholesterol, your triglycerides, your blood pressure. That's just an outcome of the amount of food you eat. So if you were trying to focus on what am I trying to say? If you're trying to focus on having good health outcomes in terms of your diet, that's the first thing I would focus on is the amount of food that you eat. So for me, rule number 1, sorry, I'm going to stop and read a comment because my voice is getting tired. Yeah, so as we would say, this is something I don't really resonate when it comes to TCM diet approach. I feel way better on a carnivore diet and see so many people glorifying plants and end up as high carb. Yeah, and that's something we kind of talked about on the podcast with Warren is how much of this is actually Chinese medical theory and how much of it is cultural. How much of it is just people in China eat rice, so they think that everybody should eat rice. We kind of talked about with dairy. There's this real big thing about in TCM, you should avoid dairy. Dairy causes dampness. Is that really true, or is that just a cultural thing that a lot of Asians are lactose intolerant, so they don't do very well with dairy? I feel like if you went to India and told people not to drink milk, they'd run you out of the country. Or if you come from a Northern European background, maybe dairy does just fine for you. So yeah, I feel kind of the same way, that sometimes I eat lots of meat and I feel really good on it. Other people, it's the exact opposite. So I think this is one of those, you kind of have to experiment on yourself and see what works best for you. And then Also, like, don't be a judgmental asshole to other people who do things differently. Some people act like they walk on water. They worship the one true God because they follow a vegan diet. It's like that movie where they said that, vegan people have superpowers. At the same time, you shouldn't be like, oh, I'm low carb. I worship the one true God because I'm on a ketogenic diet and that's the one true way. And that's not true either. Some people do really well on a ketogenic diet. Some people don't. It doesn't do much. That was kind of a funny story with Warren. I'm not sure if we mentioned it in the podcast, but I might have accidentally cut that part out. But he talked about how he's on a gluten-free diet, and the way he actually started being gluten-free is he wanted to prove it wrong, that he knew it was becoming a fad, gluten-free, and he thought it was ridiculous. So he was like, I'm going to go gluten-free for 2 weeks just to prove that it's a fad and it doesn't work. Turns out after 2 weeks, like, he felt great. His digestion was amazing. He never felt better. And so ever since then, he's been gluten-free. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, that he started off trying to prove it wrong, and it actually worked really well for him. Now, me, on the other hand, I was accidentally gluten-free for a month. I was doing a weird bodybuilder diet where I was eating nothing but chicken and broccoli. And so I realized, like, oh, I've been gluten-free for this whole month. And I really didn't feel any change. And so then I switched from that. I started eating bread every day. I didn't feel any change. So for me, didn't really do a whole lot. Same thing with dairy-free. I tried going dairy-free for a month just to see what would happen. Nothing happened. So I went back to drinking 2 glasses of milk per day with whey protein in it. I went super dairy. Still fine. Nothing happened. So for me, gluten-free versus non-gluten-free, or I guess I'd say gluten-free versus gluten, doesn't really make a difference. Dairy-free versus dairy doesn't really make a difference. What I found out for me by experimenting on myself is sugar makes a huge difference. That if I eat a lot of sugar, if I eat a lot of sugar, I tend to crave more sugar. I've noticed that. But also, sugar has an effect on my physical health in terms of inflammation. I get more breakouts when I'm eating more sugar. It also has a mental effect that I tend to be more depressed when I'm eating sugar. And so that's something that I've experimented with me, and that's something that I've noticed for me, that I need to not eat sugar. Does that mean that everybody needs to? I don't know. Another interesting one is caffeine. A lot of people vilify coffee and say that caffeine is evil. And again, this is one of those things where every body is different. That I've had some patients I've known some people that they drink 5 cups of coffee a day and they're totally fine. They have no problems. They sleep really well at night. It doesn't really affect them. I have patients that come in and they have a lot of anxiety and insomnia and things like that. And for them, even if they just drink 2 cups of coffee per week, they notice an increase in their anxiety, their panic attacks or bouts of anxiety, and their ability to sleep with just 2 cups of coffee per week. So again, every body is different. Some people really need to cut down. Some people are totally fine. So that's something that you kind of have to experiment with on yourself. See if I'm still going here. I am still going. So what are the main principles we should focus on? Well, I think number 1 is make sure you're eating the correct amount of food. Number 2 is just kind of, like you said, eat food. Maybe try to avoid junk food. And I'd like to think that deep down in their heart of hearts, most people know the difference between good food and bad food. That broccoli and vegetables are good for you. Cookies and soda are not so good for you, and just focus on eating the good things. And I think people get tripped up on this, is that I think really they know the difference. They just have this tendency that they like to convince themselves otherwise, that people are like, oh, I'm eating these cookies. These are gluten-free organic cookies. And they think that means that they're healthy. But it's like, if you sit down and eat the whole box, it doesn't matter if they're gluten-free, organic, free range, you still just ate an entire box of cookies, and that's not good. But But I do think this is something that we should be flexible with. That I kind of like to follow this rule of like 80% of your diet should be good, healthy things, and 20% of it can be fun things. So it's not like you need to vilify sugar or sweets, that you need to cut them out completely. Again, this is TCM. It's all about balance, that you can balance out those things, that as long as you're eating mostly good things, whole foods, mostly plants, or healthy foods, then you can kind of balance it out with 20% of the fun foods. And this was kind of an interesting thing that I once heard at a Jeffrey Ewan lecture, where he was talking about how different foods affect different organs. And somebody asked him, is there a food that's good for the heart and good for the shen, something that's good for the spirit? And his reply was kind of interesting. They said, yeah, if you want to help the spirit, the good foods are comfort foods, things that make you feel good, things that maybe remind you of your childhood. And it's not necessarily the most healthiest thing, but you eat it and it makes you feel good. And so I think there is some aspect where we have to take into account our shen, and you can do that with food. Do something that excites you or calms your shen, something that comforts you. You just have to make sure that's balanced. You can't be eating mac and cheese and ice cream every day. I've done that before. It doesn't work out so well. So I think that's one of the generalities I would make, that we don't necessarily have to get too specific into it versus organic versus conventional, or how many antioxidants, or what's a superfood. Just try to generally make sure you're eating good food most of the time. And then I would say, if anything, number 3, a saying I heard recently that I really liked is, this was in a Jeff Nippard video, where he said, instead of having an exclusive diet, try to create an inclusive diet. And I think this is a good thing to say. That I think too many people are trying to look at foods in terms of good and bad, and they're trying to make an effort to cut out bad things. That sugar is bad, we need to cut it out. High fructose corn syrup is bad, we need to cut it out. Saturated fats are bad, we need to cut it out. And instead of trying to think about what you shouldn't eat, maybe instead focus on having an inclusive diet. Think about all the things that you should be eating and try to have a variety. Like in TCM, we say have a variety of flavors and a variety of colors. So instead of focusing on what you shouldn't eat, try to see what kind of variety you can include from those healthy things. And then maybe you can add in that 20% of, I'm going to eat peanut M&Ms and Pop-Tarts. And as long as that's a small 10 to 20%, but then you have a variety of different fruits, vegetables that you're switching out, different types of foods, then that can balance that out. So try to be inclusive and try to create more variety with what you're eating, instead of trying to say, oh, these things are evil, I need to cut them out. What else was I going to say? Here, let me pull something up real quick, because I meant to put a slide on here. I wanted to talk about spleen qi deficiency. And I was going to use the example of pingwei-san. But let's see if we can pull up a slide about pingwei-san. See if I have that. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Oh, maybe it will. Boop, boop, ba-doo. Make sure my buttons are working. Sorry, this is kind of a crappy live stream. I had all these plans I thought was going to be really great. I feel like this is a crappy live stream, because I'm trying to do too many things at once, and I think they're all turning out bad. So, I don't know. Maybe we'll try to salvage this. Maybe we won't. So then another question I tried to ask Warren, and I was kind of baiting him on this question because I have my own opinion about this, and he played along with me. Okay, but I asked him, is spleen qi deficiency overdiagnosed? I feel like whenever anybody comes into the clinic with any kind of digestive problems, people automatically jump to spleen qi deficiency. Let's give them Sejun Zitong. Let's give them Bujang Ichitong, things like that. And I'm not always so sure that that's the case. And we kind of had this discussion about Warren said if we define spleen chi in terms of digestion, a lot of people do have really poor digestion, and so maybe that's not so far fetched that a lot of these people have spleen chi deficiency. And I guess my take on that is I'm not entirely sure this is actually a deficiency of the spleen. I think it's more that people are overwhelming and overworking the spleen, and that's why the spleen can't work. And so basically the argument I make is instead of spleen qi deficiency and giving formulas like Sujun Zitong, Liu Jun Zitong, I prefer formulas like Pingwei San. And for those who don't know, we can look at the ingredients of Pingwei San. It's a Zangju whole pool, which are in the aromatic transform damp category. Chen Pi, which is in the regulate qi category. It also has a bitter flavor that dries out dampness. And Gan Sao, licorice root, to just harmonize. And so this isn't really a tonifying formula. This is more about using the aromatic property to awaken the spleen, using the aromatic property to transform dampness, using Chen Pi to move things through the middle jiao, and using Chen Pi, the bitter flavor, to dry out the dampness. So this isn't about tonifying spleen qi. This is about awakening the spleen and getting things moving. And it's interesting, if we go look up the signs and symptoms associated with Pingwei San, we get things like distension and fullness in the epigastrium and abdomen, loss of taste, loss of appetite, heavy sensation in the limbs and body, because like the dampness, loose stools or diarrhea, easily fatigued, increased desire to sleep, nausea, vomiting, belching, feeling lazy with a preference for inactivity, lethargy. The tongue is going to be pale and swollen. The pulse is going to be slippery. And so I feel like when most students or most practitioners, if a patient came in with that list of symptoms, their immediate response would be, oh, this person has spleen qi deficiency. We need to tonify the spleen. And I think maybe in this situation, no, we don't need to add in more tonics. That a lot of people, they're already, how can I say this? A lot of people, maybe it's not that their spleen is deficient, it's that they're throwing too much crap on top of it and the spleen is overworked. So a lot of people that they're already eating too many sweet foods, do we really need to be throwing more sweet, cloying, tonifying herbs on top of that? Is that really going to help them? And in my opinion, I think most of the people that I've seen, they don't necessarily need more sweet herbs. They don't need more tonification. They might benefit from the aromatic herbs that wake up the spleen, aromatic herbs that transform dampness, and other herbs that get things moving, that we just need to help the spleen not be overworked. We don't need to give the spleen more energy. We need to give it less work to do, which means eating a smaller amount of food, eating a smaller amount of the sweet flavor, and if we give herbs, maybe give herbs that are aromatic and awakening rather than herbs that are straight up tonifying. So that's just a weird rant that I have, and I think Warren was nice enough to humor me on that one. So is that all I had for my little things I prepared? Yeah, I think that's all I had. I was going to go on a rant about kanji too. Maybe we'll skip that. I think I already went on enough of a rant. Saying, yeah, I think tonifying formulas in general are overprescribed. Yeah, I could see that, and I especially, it's kind of interesting that I saw a note about this once, especially talking about younger people, that I think this was in a martial arts book, that you have a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds that they get into this stuff and they think, oh yeah, I need to tonify my chi, I need to tonify my jing because I want to live forever. And it turns out when you're young, especially when you're young, you don't need those things. What you really need is moving herbs to make sure everything's circulating properly. You don't need to add more energy to the system. You need to make sure that energy is properly moving. Now, when you get into your 50s and 60s, maybe it's a different story. But especially when you're younger, at least this one book emphasized moving and making sure the chi is circulating rather than necessarily tonifying. So this is an interesting question from the comments. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong buttons. So this is an interesting comment. What's your take on fasting, either intermittent fasting or prolonged fasting? And this is kind of interesting because I feel like I've gone back and forth several times on the topic of fasting as I've gone through doing yoga and Chinese medicine. So I don't know if everybody knows my background, but I started out doing a lot of yoga before I got into TCM. Kind of the way I got into TCM was through yoga. I did a lot of yoga in college, and I actually lived with a yogic monk for a while. And it turns out yoga and Indians are really into fasting. And so we would fast a couple times a month. They would say if you're a household person, you should fast twice a month. If you are like a monk and celibate, you should fast 4 times a month. And basically they gave various explanations as to why fasting was healthy. A lot of times it was just like, oh, it gives your digestive system a rest and it gives your body a chance to detox. And I was always kind of like, that seems very vague. Like that doesn't seem like a very good, a very compelling argument that just like, oh, your digestive system needs a rest. That seems kind of vague and not very convincing. Then I got to TCM school, and it turns out a lot of people in Chinese medicine are very against fasting. Like I think there's this, like when you read the book A Tooth from a Tiger's Mouth, it has a section on fasting, and it basically says, don't do it. It's like your food and grain, that's your source of qi. Why would you be depriving your body of a source of qi? So that for most people, there's really no reason to fast. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And then it was interesting, I started getting on YouTube and I was watching all these videos by Jason Fung, and he talks about using fasting as a medical protocol to help with diabetes. And it turns out that now we do have all this research about the benefits of fasting, about changing your insulin sensitivity so you become more sensitive to insulin, basically the opposite of diabetes. When you have diabetes, you're insulin resistant. Well, fasting can help with insulin sensitivity. There's also the concept of autophagy. Autophagy, auto means self, phagos means eating. So autophagy is your body is eating itself. And initially that sounds really bad, but it's actually a good thing. When we say the body is eating itself, really what it's doing is it's going through and it's clearing out the junk. It's clearing out the bad cells. We're getting apoptotic with the bad cells. And so it's like you're kind of cleaning out all the junk, all the bad cells. And it turns out that this is a process. It's mediated by the mTOR pathway. So this is a process that can only happen in a fasted state. And so it turns out that, according to this research, we have a lot of good benefits. There are a lot of good health benefits when it comes to fasting. So then I flipped over. It's like, oh yeah, fasting is good. And then it was interesting. I saw some of the response to some of that stuff about fasting, and people kind of said, yeah, there are these good benefits that come from fasting, but it turns out that you get those same benefits from sleeping. That just as long as you sleep sufficiently and don't eat while you're sleeping, you can still get some of those benefits. You don't necessarily need to fast for 36 hours to get those benefits. So I think it kind of depends. And again, when it comes to this thing of every body is different, people respond differently, and people also have different preferences. So certainly when it comes to things like intermittent fasting, I think it's a matter of your preferences. Sorry, excuse me. So I think that's one of those things where it comes down to your preferences, that some people, they do really well on an intermittent fasting, or they do really well on one meal a day even, that maybe they wake up and they're not hungry, or some people that when they eat breakfast, it just makes them more sluggish. And so they prefer to not eat anything. And then some people just really enjoy having that one big meal, and that works really well for them. So some people that works really well. Other people are the exact opposite. They like eating 6 meals a day. I've been going through this bodybuilder phase where I've been eating 6 meals a day, and that's been working really well for me. So I think it's a matter of preference on that point. Yeah, and then it's interesting that here we're saying it's kind of like people are overeating. And I think that's also an interesting thing, where sometimes we talk about fasting and sometimes people use a more vague term, time-restricted eating. And I have seen interesting studies on that, where they would do research where they would track what people eat And they weren't really concerned with what they were eating. They were more concerned with when they were eating. And so they had people track basically they had this app, so they were tracking when people started eating first thing in the day and when they stopped eating last thing in the day. And they found that if they had people where that eating window was greater than 12 hours, what they did is they came back and said, try to reduce that window from 12 hours to 10 hours. So if your first meal is at 7 a.m. when you eat breakfast, then try to make it 5 p.m. when you eat your dinner or something like that. Try to reduce that window to be shorter. And they found that they had all these amazing health results just by shortening their eating window by a couple hours. They had very good results. I think I'm not paraphrasing the study very well, so you might have to go look this up. I'm getting the details wrong. But the gist of it was just by shortening their eating window by a couple hours, they saw some very positive health results. And so yeah, I guess that is something to think about. That if people, it's basically like if your first meal of the day is at 6 a.m. and your last meal is at midnight when you eat a little bit of ice cream before you go to bed, or you have a glass of wine before you go to bed, it's like you're only going 6 hours without eating. That's not a very large window of fasting for some of those things, some of those bodily processes to occur. I'm not sure that wasn't a very coherent answer. I don't know. Any other questions about food? I think that's all I have to say about food. I think that sounded a whole lot better in my head than it actually came out, but that's usually how things go. I feel like now I know how it feels when I do a podcast with someone, how it feels for the other person there. Spleen qi deficiency is overdiagnosed among students. Yeah, it's like everybody wants to take Gui Pitong. Again, is the spleen actually deficient, or are we just giving it too much work? Oh, Food That's Good for the Shen, a great podcast by Andrew Huberman. I'll have to check that out. So yeah, if you want to know more about food, check out Andrew Huberman. I think liver chi stagnation is also overdiagnosed. I don't know. I was gonna say is liver chi stagnation overdiagnosed? How do I want to answer that one? I guess I feel like a yes and no on that one, and I guess what I think is it's not necessarily that it's overdiagnosed. It's more that liver chi stagnation is the branch and there's some other root cause going on. Because yeah, everybody has liver chi stagnation. And so sometimes we have to look at, if we see these signs and symptoms of liver chi stagnation, is there some other underlying cause to it? So one way to think about it is remember that liver and gallbladder belong to the wood phase. We say wood it's like a general commanding the troops. The emotion of the liver is anger, and we say the gallbladder holds the office of rectifier. Basically, the gallbladder is a judge that determines what's right and what's wrong. And so I think that basically when things start to go wrong, the liver is loud. The voice of the liver is shouting. So when things start to go wrong, it's not necessarily that the liver is the main problem. It could just be that the liver is shouting the loudest. And so it could be that there's something else going on that's causing the liver to get angry. And just by soothing liver chi, that might not correct the problem. We may need to look deeper and seeing what's the underlying cause. So yeah, I can agree with that. Chinese medicinal porridges. Yeah, congee. That's something we kind of talked about in the podcast as well, where it's like I'm not a big fan of congee. So the English term is congee, Congee, and basically that's rice porridge. Normally when you cook rice, you take like 1 cup of rice and 2 cups of water and boil it for like 20 minutes. Well, when you make a congee, it's more like you take a cup of rice and 8 cups of water and boil it for like several hours, and it becomes a rice porridge. And this is something like In the Shanghan Lun, when we talk about guizhitang, what Zhong Dongjing says is you prepare the guizhitang, you drink the guizhitang, you cover up in a blanket, and then you give the patient congee. And so kind of the idea there is it's something that's very easy to digest. Rice is both sweet and bland, so it's very easy on the spleen. Basically, when you cook it this way, it's pre-digested, so your spleen doesn't have to do a lot of work to digest it, and it's just a very easy source of calories. And so I guess that's another thing where I feel like there are a lot of people who say, oh, this person has spleen qi deficiency, let's give them congee. And first of all, most people in the West don't want to cook rice for several hours and then eat it. It's like people won't cook herbs. They're not going to cook congee. It's just too much work. The other thing is, I think congee is really good if you're recovering from an illness. Say you got the stomach flu and you were really nauseous, you were vomiting, you didn't have an appetite. So it's like I've had that situation where it's like I got sick and I basically didn't eat anything for 3 days because I was nauseous the whole time. Well, at that point when you're recovering, it could be that congee is really good because it's really bland, it's really easy to stomach, and it's something very simple that it's not going to put a lot of work on your digestive system, so it's really easy to get some energy in your system. But if you have a patient that's coming in with that swollen tongue, lethargic, a little bit overweight, maybe pre-diabetic, in my opinion, that person probably doesn't need congee. They don't need an easily digestible source of carbohydrates. They don't need more of that in their diet. Again, we don't need that sweet flavor adding energy to the system. We probably need something more aromatic that awakens the system, or something that gets rid of the dampness, that puts less work on the spleen by getting rid of the junk. So I'm not necessarily a big fan of congee. I guess if where I do like congee, basically, I think that oatmeal is kind of like the American version of congee, where it's simple, it's fairly bland, it's easy to digest, it's a lot easier to cook. You can just get instant or quick oats, and it's really easy to cook. And that way, at least it's not a super simple, or at least that way it's not like a really high glycemic carb. That's something that you still have some fiber in there that's good to slow things down. I think oats kind of have a little bit of a bitter flavor, and it could be that we need more bitter flavor in our diet. And it's with oatmeal, it's something that it's very versatile. You can use it as a base and add different things on it depending on what you're trying to do. If you want to warm the interior, you can add warming spices like cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, clove, basically pumpkin pie spice, and you can add in those warming ingredients. If you want to make it more nourishing, you can add in things like black sesame, ground up black sesame, dates, goji berries, things like that are more tonifying, more nourishing. You can put in walnuts to tonify yang. So you have some different options of how to modify that in a way that's easy for people. And so I guess I feel like telling people to make congee with lotus seeds is going to be really difficult for most people. But if you tell people to make oatmeal with cinnamon and walnuts, that's a little bit easier in terms of patient compliance. Yeah, my grandfather used to cook congee for us when we were sick, but he called it gruel. Yeah, kind of the same thing. I think sometimes they call it rice porridge or rice gruel, and it's just in China they had a lot of rice, so they used rice, whereas other people in the South, that's what's grits. They grind up corn and make it into a gruel or a porridge, or other people use wheat and make wheat porridge, things like that. So yeah, just in general, I feel like 500 years ago, congee was probably a really great thing. In modern times, maybe people don't need an easily digestible, high glycemic carbohydrate. People don't need more of that in their diet. Eleanor is from Chicago. Hope things are going well in Chicago. I guess it's spring now. I'm in Colorado, and it just like snowed 3 inches, so hopefully things. Yeah, cultural considerations I think are interesting, like cultural and lifestyle things, and that's something we kind of talked about on the podcast with Warren when we talked about food. There's a link to the podcast. It's like, what of these things? First of all, we can ask, like, the types of things we say in TCM, how much of this is actual medical theory and how much of it is it just cultural? When you talk about you have to eat red meat in order to build blood, is that really true, or is that just a cultural thing? Or maybe that was true 200 years ago, but maybe now with our modern food choices, you don't have to eat meat to build blood. Things like rice kanji, is that good for everybody, or is that just a cultural thing? Things like dairy, is it just that Chinese people don't do well with dairy, whereas Indian people eat a lot of dairy? So I think some of those things are cultural, some of those things are lifestyle, and I think we can kind of take the general concept and adapt it. That in China they like to eat rice, but maybe it's easier for you to eat oats. Maybe it's easier for you to eat corn. Things like that. I have tried cream of rice. That was another weird bodybuilder thing. That was Mr. Olympia John Meadows is always like, oh, pre-workout, you should eat cream of rice with protein powder in it. So I tried that for a while. But otherwise, kanji, it's too hard to make. Says, I feel like vegetables ages ago must have had different qualities than what we get in supermarkets these days. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's also that I think talking about what happened at different times in terms of food, I think it's people like to talk about like soil quality and stuff like that, how that affected the nutrition. But really, I think one of the main things is, if we were talking like 1,000 years ago, that most of the population subsisted on I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of, staple crops. And so it's like when I was in India, I was in a very rural part of India, and basically they ate mostly rice. It was like your plate was mostly rice, and they had like a small amount of vegetables and maybe a small amount of meat, just because vegetables were expensive. So I think that maybe 500 years ago, yeah, the vegetables were different, but I think maybe they weren't eating as many vegetables either, just because they were living off of these staples depending on your area. That could have been, if you were in Asia, that was probably rice. If you were in Africa, that was like cassava, I think. If you were in Ireland, that was potatoes, and they ate mostly these subsistence crops. So my boyfriend does pro audio and loves your setup. Oh, so this is the here we can show the setup, just if we want to nerd out a little bit more. I have a Rode pod mic hooked up to a cloud lifter, hooked up to a Scarlett 2i2, and so I wanted to try the pod mic because I think it looks a little bit better. Oh, this is a blue Compass boom arm. Oh yeah, there's a blue logo right there. So this is a Rode pod mic. It's like $100 microphone. If I wanted to be really fancy, I actually do have a Shure SM7B. That's like that's the professional microphone. This is the one all the professionals. Joe Rogan uses this on his podcast. A Shure SM7B. A lot of the famous streamers use that. So if I wanted to be really impressive, I should have broken out the Shure SM7B. It just doesn't. I feel like it doesn't go on this boom arm very well. And I wanted to see how this pod mic differed as well. This one has a lot of low frequencies, and I feel like with my voice it gets a little bit muddy. So I wanted to see what the frequency response on the cheaper microphone was like. Does that mean that TCM classic advice is just outdated now and we shouldn't follow it anymore? That's an interesting question. It's like, does that apply to all of TCM? And that brings up kind of interesting conversations. I think I kind of talked about this on the podcast with Patrick about should we really be following traditional Chinese medicine, because so much has changed. Our lifestyles have changed, our environment has changed, and to what extent do we need to adapt to the modern times? I mean, it's like when sometimes I'd use this example. It's like when Zhong Zhongjing was prescribing his formulas, like people were dying of epidemics. But you have to understand, Zhong Zhongjing's time, like people's diets were completely different. People were living mostly outdoors. People didn't have air conditioning. People didn't have access to the kind of foods we have, things like that. It's like, to what extent is that stuff applicable now? And I mean, his kind of response was, anything that happened then we can still frame in a TCM way and still do it. But I think that's like kind of an interesting discussion when we look at some of this classical stuff, like to what extent does it still apply? Because sometimes we have in things like herbs, when we talk about, it's like when you study herbs, there's like a whole bunch of herbs for that treat malaria, because that was a big deal. And it's like in a modern clinic, you don't really see a whole lot of malaria cases. Or there's a lot of herbs that are good for pinworms, like different parasites, like pinworms and things like that. And I remember one of my Chinese teachers saying that in his generation, when he was a child, that was still a big deal, that his mother worked in a hospital, and she would sometimes take stool samples, and where you could see the pinworms and the pinworm eggs and the stool samples of children's. And so they would he would get to go over and look in the microscope to see the pinworms and the eggs. And his mother would say, this is why you have to wash your hands every time you eat, before you eat, because if you don't, you're going to get pinworms like this. And so that was a big deal. So 50 years ago, treating pinworms was a very common thing in China. Nowadays, we don't really see pinworms so much. So it's like, are those herbs useless now because we're not treating pinworms? Things like that. Should we be using the Shanghan Lun? I mean, because like I said, when Zhong Zhongjing was prescribing his formulas, people were dying of cold damage. If a patient comes in and says, like, I got the sniffles, I feel real bad, I can't afford to be sick right now, my daughter has a recital this weekend and I really need to go to it. It's like, do you really need Ma Huang Tong, or do you just need to go home and sleep? At this point, I'm just rambling, so maybe we should just, we've been going for a while. We've been going for over an hour. I wanted to try to keep down to an hour because I feel like nobody wants to watch a video for more than an hour. There's a big trend in microbiome reset programs involving taking digestive supplements for a set period of time to reset gut bacteria. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about that, so I'm not sure I can comment about that. Sorry, I was just thinking about like fecal transplants and things like that, and kind of what impacts those have on the gut biome and what impacts those have on other systems in the body, where people have like personality changes when they change their gut biome and stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Oh, good. We're saying my buttons aren't working. Cloud lifter with the pod mic sounds great. Awesome. I'm gonna have to listen back to this and see how it sounds with my voice. See how the frequency response is. I don't have this going through any kind of equalizer, so I'm kind of curious just to see how it sounds in my voice. I actually haven't recorded anything long term on this microphone. I've been started doing voiceovers with the Shure SM7B. So that's the other thing, is I'm kind of curious to see how this sounds with my voice. Usually on the podcast, I'm talking into the Shure SM7B, and when I had the people in person, they were talking into the pod mic. So see how it sounds. And usually when we're doing a live stream, I have a shotgun microphone. This is I think it's a Rode NTG. So usually I do the shotgun microphone. I think it looks better for videos, but just this time we set up the dynamic microphone. I'm just rambling about microphones now. We should probably go ahead and call it a day. I'm going to go to the gym, drink some more caffeine, go to the gym. Let me know if there are any other questions. I was going to answer some Q&A questions. Somebody left some comments on on some of we had that formula review series. I did know some questions on the comments for that formula review series. I was going to try to answer that on this one, but I forgot to take a screenshot of it. So I'll probably just type out an answer, but I'll also probably do some stuff on the community website. I might just make a short video and upload it there. So if you're a member of the Patreon, remember you can, if you're on the Patreon, will this work? If you're a Patreon member, you have access to this this site, innercircle.tcmstudy.net. It's basically like a Facebook group, but it's not on Facebook, so there's no ads, and they're not going to sell your data. There were, I saw some Q&A, some questions. I might just post them on there. So if you're a member of the Patreon, go look at that. Did you do the part 3 of the formulas? Yeah, I did the part 3 of the formulas, and I forgot to send out an email. So I think I announced it on Facebook, on the Facebook page, and maybe on my own Facebook page, but I forgot to send out an email. So I sent out an email afterwards. So if you're on the email list, it has some links to all 3 parts. Those 3 parts are still up. So if you're on the email list, you should have gotten an email with links to all 3 parts. I'll go ahead and post something. I'm pretty sure you're on the Patreon. I'll go ahead and post something on the Patreon feed as well. I've been meant to do that, to put links to all 3 sections, because they're still up there. They're just unlisted. So if you just go to the YouTube channel, you won't be able to find them, because I'm going to leave them up for a couple weeks, and then what I'm going to start doing this weekend is start re-recording those and making a full course. So kind of like we have the single herb review course, I'm going to make a formula review course and break it down into sections and stuff like that. TCM to training in the gym. Whew, I don't know about that. We kind of talked about, I guess we kind of talked about that with, there was another live stream where we talked about muscles, and we kind of talked about, we can think about the musculature as yin-yang pairs, that on the one hand, because each joint has opposing action. So you have one set of muscles that flex the joint and one set of muscles that extend the joint. So we can think about those in yin-yang pairs. We can also think of the individual muscles usually have 2 states. They have a relaxed state and a contracted state. So you can think about that as a yin-yang pair. And so we can think about balancing those things out, that we need to balance out the pairs of muscles so you don't end up looking like this. But then we also need to balance out the state of the muscle, that the muscle has to be strong, but it also has to be relaxed. So you need to strengthen and stretch. Yeah, I'll go ahead and post something on the Patreon right after this, because I meant to put a link on there and I didn't. So I sent out an email, but I'll go ahead and post it in a couple different places. Well, this is interesting, the 5 elements and how different people respond to different training. Yeah, and I feel like this would be a thing where it's like maybe wood people are more into resistance training, whereas metal people are more into aerobic activities, things like that. All right, I think that's it. I think that at this point I'm rambling. Yeah, your setup is pro. Yeah, this is overkill. This is what it's like. I was on a Zoom call with someone. They're like, "Your picture looks so much better than mine." It's like, yeah, if you saw all the lights and microphones and live streaming into a $3,000 camera, that's overkill. I don't need this much equipment. Just use your cell phone. It's fine. Just use the camera on your phone. All right, that's it. Let's. I'm just rambling. Let's get out of here. Special thank you to the Patreon members. Thank you for supporting the website. If you want to join them in supporting, there's a link in the description below. If you want to join the Patreon, that's really the best way to support the website. There are some other ways you can support it. You can go to the website and look at the resources thing, that buying your books through the website, that earns us a commission. There's merch on the website and stuff like that. Those are other ways you can support the website. If you don't want to support us monetarily, that's totally cool. I know that most students are poor and don't have a lot of money. So even just showing up, liking things, sharing things, that really helps us out, and I really appreciate it. So thank you everyone for all your support. Also, I do really recommend Warren's book, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen. I put a link to that in the description below, so I definitely check out that. It's a really good book. He also has a blog. I think it's ancientwisdomcooking.com. He has a blog where he has some sample recipes that was mentioned in the podcast as well. So if you go to the podcast, I think there will be links to that as well. So definitely check out Warren's stuff. If you have any questions that you want to answer next time, go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and we can do that on the next live stream. We're trying to do live streams every week. Sorry I messed up the time this morning. I scheduled it at the wrong time, but we still came at the same time. So I think that's all. We will see you next week, Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Central. Have a good weekend. I think most people had finals this week. I'm not sure if this is just Pacific College, but I think a lot of people had finals. So hopefully your finals went well. Hopefully you have a break coming up. You'll do something fun over break. And as for me, I'm gonna see if there's not too much snow on the ground. We might head over to the gym, because that's all I do with my life is go to the gym. Have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.